Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I think we got most of the folks who are going to be here. And I know we've got a fairly high percentage of people who weren't here last time. So, I always review, but I'm going to be reviewing again, obviously. When we get started, we're going to be getting started with 1 Maccabees chapter 5. We did the first 4 chapters last time. And to sort of reset the scene of what's going on, when we moved from Esther to Maccabees, we jumped way forward in time. Right now, when we pick up, we're going to be picking up around 150 BC. So we went from the 400s BC to the 100s BC. And moving between those books. And we talked about last time how in between, Alexander the Great conquered the world, and how after he did that, the chunks of the world that he had conquered were divvied up by his generals. And the 2 main generals that had reference to us were Ptolemy, who made his capital the new city of Alexandria that Alexander had founded and named after himself in Egypt. In Egypt, his capital. And from there he was the ruler of Alexandria and all Africa. And
what that has Maccabees.
Yeah. And the second one, who was of most important to us, was his general Seleucus. Seleucus, we mentioned, was the head of his special forces. A group called the Silver Shields. It was Alexander the Great, sort of SEAL Team 6 at the time. And so being one of his most prominent generals, he became the ruler of Syria and all the East. And he founded for his new capital, which he named after his son, the city of Antioch, on the Orontes River in Syria, which is the Antioch after which our archdiocese is named. And we talked about how these divisions with these generals of Alexander's were followed later in the Roman Empire, in terms of the major divisions of their empire, and then followed by the church, which is why we have a patriarch of Antioch and all the East, whose territory goes all the way to India, because that's where Seleucus' territory was, and Antioch was his capital. Why we have a patriarch of Alexandria and all Africa, because it followed those same basic divisions. So we also mentioned that Alexander, one of the things he picked up, and his generals after him, was this idea that the ruler of a nation is somehow connected to the gods, is divine. You don't really find that in Greece. Right? In Greece, when Pericles was elected as head of Athens, he didn't claim he was a god. Right? In fact, that would have been absurd. They would have run him out of town on a rail. You know what I mean? He wouldn't have claiming he was a god. Okay, but Alexander, after going to Egypt and being proclaimed pharaoh and worshipped as a god there, then going and conquering territory further east and being worshipped as a god there, kind of took a liking to it. And so this gets sort of assimilated into the culture of these Greek rulers. And so these titles, they start taking these titles for themselves, which we have after the numbers. So Seleucus the first took the title Nicator, which means the victorious. And his son Antiochus the first took the title Soter, which means Savior. Okay? And when we got to the beginning of Maccabees, the current ruler on the Seleucid throne was Antiochus IV Epiphanes, meaning the manifestation of God on earth. Okay? This is where the same root as Epiphany for the feast we just celebrated. Okay, so there's this integral connection now between the government authority and religion. And I also commented that later on, when there's a Caesar in the Roman Empire, Caesar is going to take all these titles for himself.
Sounds like a quote.
Yeah. And so when Caesar takes all these titles for himself, it's something we don't appreciate when we read the New Testament now. But at the time the New Testament was written, when the authors, the apostles, would call Jesus Christ the Savior, that was an act of treason. When they said he was the manifestation of God on earth, that was treason. Okay, because these titles belong just to Caesar. Right? So every time they said Jesus is Lord, they were implying Caesar isn't. Okay. Well, foreshadowing this, we saw that the Jews of this age under Antiochus IV Epiphanes were having the same problem. Because they, of course, weren't willing to worship him or his gods. And so we saw how this rift developed in the Jewish civilization between those who really sort of liked Hellenism and liked Greek culture and wanted to be part of it, and so sort of sold out and became collaborators, and those who believed in trying to still follow the law, the Torah, that had been given to them, and keeping their own customs and their own worship. And this sort of climaxed when Antiochus IV Epiphanes committed what's called in the Bible the abomination of desolation that we talked about last time. It's referred to as that here in 1 Maccabees, and it's referenced in the book of Daniel, and it's referenced in the book of Revelation, because it's pretty much, from the perspective of the people who wrote the Bible, the most horrible thing you could do. And that is, on a return from a victorious trip fighting his fellow Greeks in Egypt, he went into the temple in Jerusalem, put up a statue of Zeus in the Holy of Holies, and then sacrificed a pig to it on the altar. So from the perspective of the Jews, that's pretty much as bad. The most heinous, blasphemous thing you could do. Okay? And so that, essentially, they responded by not using the temple anymore. At that point, they considered it to have been defiled. Okay? So, we read last time, this is about where we picked up at the beginning of 1 Maccabees. Antiochus IV Epiphanes issued a decree that everyone was to follow the Hellenistic, the Greek religion and customs, and all other customs were to be abolished immediately. And anyone who refused to obey was to be executed. So you want to eat kosher food, executed. You don't want to worship Zeus, executed. You want to observe the Sabbath, executed. And we read about how one particular family, the father of whom was Mattathias, decided to rebel. And basically when the officials from Antiochus came to try to woo Mattathias over, they say, hey, you're one of the main men of your city, why don't you come over, sacrifice to our gods, everything will be good, we'll make it worth your while, you'll be the king's friend, everything will be good. He and his sons killed them and several of the Jews who were collaborating with them. Okay? And from there, they went out into the desert, started assembling an army of like-minded rebels, started conducting guerrilla attacks, started circumcising Jews who had been circumcised by force, and eventually managed to, the top map here, eventually managed to gain independence for that little piece of territory in the top map. Now you can see that's a lot smaller than Judah's ever been. Right? But that much territory they managed to get functioning independently, the Greek government, after a number of battles. The climactic battle we talked about was the Battle of Emmaus, where they had sort of the big showdown that the brothers, the sons of Mattathias, won, led by the main brother being Judas Maccabeus, which means Judah the Hammer in Hebrew, who the book is named after. That's where Maccabees comes from, is from his surname, the Hammer. So he is the main leader. He manages with these military victories, main one coming at Emmaus, and then they rededicated the temple. They went in and cleaned it out, relit the lamps, and that's where we left off last time, as that being the origin of Hanukkah. But that's where the Feast of Hanukkah comes from, is remembering the time at which they had to come and cleanse and restore the temple after it had been defiled, and relight the candle stand. And at the time, they only had 1 day worth of oil that hadn't been defiled. They found one little jar of oil that was still sealed. And it was only about 1 day's worth, but miraculously it lasted for 7 days, until on the 8th day they were able to get more oil. And so that's the miracle that's out of the Feast of Lights, or Hanukkah. And then right at the end, I talked a little bit about the significance of Emmaus being the place where this big battle was won. And the story at the end of the Gospel of Luke about the two disciples on the road to Emmaus. And how this story that we've been reading here in 1 Maccabees shaped the way people in Jesus' time looked at who the Messiah was going to be. In fact, Judas Maccabeus was pretty much their model of what the Messiah was going to do. That the Messiah was going to come and overthrow the Romans the way Judah the Hammer came and overthrew the Greeks, right, and threw them out. And how that was a fundamental misunderstanding. That a lot of the New Testament even is sort of paralleling this. For example, St. John the Forerunner appears out in the wilderness, baptizing these people and assembling this group of followers. Right? Well, the assumption, based on Maccabees, would be, oh, this is going to be the Messiah's army. Right? He's going to go out there and, we talked about how when Christ comes and then doesn't do that, even St. John sends a disciple to him saying, are you the guy? Or is there another guy coming? Because even he's not sure. And so in that episode on the road to Emmaus, the only other place in the Bible where this village is mentioned, right, that they're going to this city where this battle was fought, the first thing that the disciples say to Jesus when Jesus asks them what they're talking about and why they're so sad is, well, we thought Jesus was going to be the one to deliver Israel. We thought he was going to be the one who was going to come and throw the Romans out. But apparently not, because the Romans killed him. Right? And then what does Jesus do? Jesus goes and explains the scriptures to them to say that's not what the Messiah was about. Right? The Messiah is coming to fight not the Romans, but the real enemies, which are death, the devil, sin. Right? Those are the enemies who the Messiah is coming to destroy. And it's only after that, and after he breaks bread with them, representing communion, that they recognize him suddenly. Now, where it clicks together. Okay? And so picking up from that, I want to go a little further with that tonight. Because it's important for the whole way we read the Old Testament. Okay? I was reminded of this morning in Matins. One of the things we didn't do in Matins, in Festal Matins, is the Polyelios. And the Polyelios for today had this particular psalm. Yeah, had Psalm 130. This one had Psalm 137, or 136, depending on if you're in the Septuagint. And Psalm 137 we also sing in Great Lent. And the interesting thing about it is that the psalm was written at the time that the Jews were in exile in Babylon. And basically, to summarize it quickly, it says, how can we, while we're here in exile, sing praises to God? And then it kind of shifts to the Edomites. Because the Edomites when the Israelites or when the Judahites were carried off into exile, mocked them, robbed them on the road, right? Pillaged their houses. Okay? And it concludes with the person writing the psalm saying, "Blessed will be the man who takes the Edomites' babies and smashes them against the rocks." That's a pretty horrible thing to say. Right? That's, so especially if, you read the New Testament, where I thought we weren't supposed to be all about revenge, and horrible, violent things like that, right? Well, if you read the Church Fathers, the way the Church Fathers interpret that is that it's not talking about the people, the Edomites, right? It's talking about our real enemies. Right? And it's not talking about being in exile from Judah and Babylon. It's talking about us being in exile from paradise because of our sin. Right? And who are our enemies? We're in exile because of our sin from paradise. Who are our enemies who gloat over us being in sin? They're Satan and the demons. Right? And so they interpret these little ones, right, the Edomites, as being temptations and sinful thoughts. Right? And so it's blessed is the man who takes even the little sins and sinful and casts them aside. Okay? Now, from one perspective, coming at it from outside, that looks like a big cop-out, right? Right? Because obviously the person who wrote that psalm wasn't talking about that. The person who wrote that psalm was ticked off at some Edomites, right? And wanted revenge, right? Yep. And they were in Babylon, okay? They wanted revenge. And so somebody, especially somebody who's not a Christian, right, who's not religious, will come and say, "Look at all this horrible stuff in the Old Testament. You're just trying to explain it away. You're just trying to explain it away." Okay? But where that interpretation, and other similar interpretations, like when we get to the book of Joshua, all that slaughter we read about, and I was talking to you about it as we went, about how to interpret it. Where that comes from isn't, "Oh gosh, this is horrible, we need to explain this away somehow." Right? It comes from the explanation that Jesus gave on the road to Emmaus. Because the church fathers looked and said, the believers, including St. Paul before his conversion, at the time of Christ, right? They read this stuff literally. And it took them in the exact wrong direction. Right? St. Paul ended up killing Christians. Okay, these people ended up looking for this political Messiah who was going to come and overthrow the Romans. And they missed Jesus. Okay? So the fathers said, we're not going to get fooled again. Right? That's not the road to go down. Because that's the wrong road. Look where it led them. Right? Right? Jesus is pointing out to them, it's not about overthrowing the Romans or the Greeks or any other people. It's about sin, death, hell. These are the real enemies. Okay? So the fathers are going back and reading the rest of the Old Testament in that light. In that light. Not as a cop-out, but being consistent. Right? Being consistent. Because once we see who the real Messiah is, right, that has to change the way we read the whole thing. Okay, so I wanted to make that point because you'll hear a lot. It's one of the favorite things to do, especially by atheists now, is to find the most horrible sounding things they can find in the Old Testament. Yeah. Right, and throw them out, and then any explanation you try to give, oh, that's a cop-out, oh, you're trying to explain it. Right? And what we have to be able to show them is, no, we're being consistent. We're being consistent with what we believe about Jesus. Okay? Once we see Jesus for who he actually is, that has to change how we read all those prophecies. Okay? So this is very important. Here. And St. Luke was trying to see, for us, unless you've read 1 Maccabees, the fact that the road leads to Emmaus is of no significance whatsoever. But to the people at the time, they were all very aware of what the Battle of Emmaus was. Okay, that was like Valley Forge to them, right? Or Gettysburg, right? I mean, this was a battle, you could just drop it and they knew exactly what you were talking about. Okay, so saying they're on the road to Emmaus is referring to this whole theological line of thought that had gotten them into trouble. That the Romans were their real enemies, that the kingdom they were looking for was one on a strip of land in Palestine here in this world. That whole line of thought, which turned out to be completely the opposite of true once Christ revealed himself. Hey, so before we get started, chapter 5, does anybody have any questions about any of that? Okay. So now we're on our top map. Judas Maccabeus is essentially running the show. He's not really king because they don't really have one, right? This is basically a band of guerrillas fighting for independence. And so they've managed to eke out independence for themselves in that territory. They've rededicated the temple. And now we're going to see how the people around them feel about it. And it's pretty much exactly as you might guess. Chapter 5, verse 1, when the surrounding nations heard the altar was repaired and the sanctuary renewed as before, they were extremely angry. Yeah. Because you remember under Nehemiah and Ezra when they were first coming back and settling. So it's because, they're going to declare their independence. Oh, they're going to cause trouble. Well, now they've actually done that. Now they've declared their independence and now they're causing trouble. Verse 2, so they resolved to kill the race of Jacob who lived among them, and they began to kill and destroy the people. So, what that's saying is, they don't immediately attack our independent Judea here, but they go and start attacking the Jewish people who are living in the other territories. Okay. Verse 3, thus Judas waged war on the sons of Esau in Idumea at Acrabaten, for they were besieging Israel. He struck them a great blow, humbled them, and took spoils from them. He also recalled the evil acts by the sons of Baan, who trapped and snared the people in ambush out on the roads. He shut them up in their towers and encamped around them, vowing to destroy them. So he set their towers on fire with everyone inside. This is why he has the nickname the Hammer. He doesn't mess around. So, basically his response to them attacking the Jewish people who are living around them is to declare war on them and start to expand his territory. And over the course of the next couple chapters, we're going to go from map 1 to map 2 in terms of how much territory they control. Verse 6, then he crossed over against the sons of Ammon and found a strong army and many people with Timothy as their leader. He fought many battles against them until he struck them down and they were crushed before him. Then he overpowered Jazer and its villages and came back to Judea. Now the foreigners in Gilead assembled against the Israelites living within their borders to destroy them. But they fled into the fortress of Dathema and sent letters to Judas and his brothers saying, the Gentiles have gathered against us and surrounded us to destroy us. They have made ready to come here and overpower the fortress where we have taken refuge, and Timothy is in charge of their army. Now therefore come and deliver us from their hand, for many of our men have perished. All our brothers in the region of Tob have been put to death, and they took their wives and children captive, along with their possessions. And they destroyed about 1,000 men there. While their letters were being read, behold, other envoys arrived from Galilee with torn garments and reported similar words, saying that those from Ptolemais, Tyre, Sidon, and all Galilee of the Gentiles had assembled themselves together to destroy us. So when Judas and the people heard these words, a great assembly was gathered to decide what to do for their brothers who were in trouble and were being attacked by adversaries. So Judas told Simon his brother, choose men for yourself and go and save your brothers in Galilee, while my brother Jonathan and I go to Gilead. He left Joseph the son of Zechariah and Azariah, a leader of the people, with the rest of the army in Judea to guard it. He ordered them, saying, take charge of this people, but do not go into battle against the Gentiles until we return. Then 3,000 troops were chosen for Simon to go to Galilee, and 8,000 men for Judas to take to Gilead. So the problem now is Gilead, as you can see on the second map, is up north on the other side of the Jordan River. And Galilee is up by the Sea of Galilee. The area of Tyre and Sidon is what's now Lebanon. So that's even farther north. So the problem is they get word that the Jewish people are being massacred in these sort of remote areas far to the north. So it's, well, what do? We can't, we don't have a big enough army to invade all the territory between here and there. So they divide the army in three. They leave part to guard Judea, and Judas, his brother Jonathan, take part of the army to go across the Jordan into Gilead. Simon takes the other part of the army, this expedition way up north into Galilee to try to rescue what people they can.
Which town is in Galilee?
Galilee is further north than that map. Up by the Sea of Galilee. It's much further north. So verse 21, Thus Simon went into Galilee and fought many battles with the Gentiles and crushed the Gentiles before him. He chased them to the gates of Ptolemais, and 3,000 Gentiles perished, and he took their spoils. So he took the Israelites of Galilee and Arbada, along with their wives and children and everything they possessed, and brought them with great joy to Judea. Meanwhile, Judas Maccabees and Jonathan his brother crossed over the Jordan and journeyed 3 full days into the desert. They came upon the Nabateans, who met them peacefully and told them everything that had happened to their brothers in Gilead. Many have been imprisoned in Bozrah and Bosor and Alema, Chaspho, Maked, and Karnaim. All these cities were fortified and strong. And some have been imprisoned in the remaining cities of Gilead. Tomorrow your foes will attack the strongholds to destroy and capture all of them in one day. Judas and his forces returned at once to Bozrah by the desert road, and he captured the city, killed all the males by the edge of the sword, took all the spoils, and set the city on fire. He marched from there by night, and they kept going until they reached the fortress of Dathama. Then at daybreak they looked up and beheld many people, too many to count, carrying ladders and engines of war to take the fortress and strike the Israelites inside. So he travels up on the other side of the Jordan. He takes a few cities, and then by the time they get to this fortress where the Jews have holed up, there's a huge army there laying siege to the fortress. Okay, so his people are inside the fortress. Fortress is being attacked as he arrives to try to save them. Verse 31, When Judas saw the battle had started, an outcry went up from the city to heaven with trumpets and loud shouts. So he said to his army of men, Fight today for the sake of our brothers. Then he came up behind them in 3 companies, and they sounded the trumpets and cried aloud in prayer. When Timothy's army saw that they faced Maccabees, they fled before him. He struck them a great blow, and on that day 8,000 of them perished. Judas then made his way to Alema. He waged war and captured it, taking its spoils and setting the city on fire. He marched on from there and captured Chaspho, Maked, and Bosor, and the remaining cities of Gilead. Timothy, however, called together more troops and set up camp opposite Raphan across the stream. Judas dispatched soldiers to scout the camp, and they returned to him, saying, All the foreigners have gathered around us, and a very large army is with them. Further, they have hired Arab mercenaries to help, and they are also camped on the other side of the stream, prepared to come against you in battle. So Judas went out to face them. Timothy told the officers of his army while Judas and his camp drew near the stream, If he crosses the stream against us first, we will be unable to withstand him, for he is strong enough to defeat us. But if he is frightened and sets up camp across the stream, we will pass over against him and crush him. So Timothy has retreated across the Jordan River. He set up camp. He's got what's left of his army and a bunch of Arab Nabatean mercenaries there. And he knows Judas Maccabeus is out there. So this is his confidence test. Right? He says if when he shows up, he comes right across the river and attacks us, we know we're in trouble. Right? So we better retreat. If he comes up and camps on the opposite side of the river, that means he's not confident. Right? That means he's kind of considering his options, setting up for battle. If he does that, then we're going to attack and hit him first and try to force him to retreat. Verse 42, But as Judas approached the water, he stationed the scribes of the troops near the stream and ordered them, Do not allow anyone to stay in camp, but make all of them join the battle. So Judas crossed over to meet them first with all the men behind him. Then all the Gentiles were crushed by them. They dropped their weapons and fled into the sacred regions of Karnaim. So Judas captured the city and set the sacred precinct on fire, along with all those residing there. This carnine was defeated, for they were not able to stand against Judas. Now, a little note about the sacred precincts. In Greek cities, classical Greek cities, the cities were divided up into sections, and the sections were dedicated to different gods. Okay, but one of those precincts, there's one that was the market, the agora, the open market. There were residential areas. But one of those areas was the areas where the temples to the gods were, where all the feasts of the gods were celebrated, where all the sacrifices were made. Okay, so when it says that they retreated to the sacred precincts, what that means is they all went and holed up at the temples. The idea being that they were praying for their gods to protect them. Okay, so it's passed over pretty quickly here. But that's what happened. They went and prayed for their gods to protect them, and Judas followed them, killed them all, and burned the place down. Right? That's what that said. So their gods didn't do so well right? against the real God. Did he or were they one?
No, I mean, that's sort of, do to them what they did in Jerusalem.
Well, no, it doesn't say that human sacrifice would be frowned upon. Verse 45, after this, Judas assembled all the Jews living in Gilead from small to great, along with their wives and children and their possessions, a great entourage, to return to the land of Judah. So you notice, there is territorial expansion here, but that's not his main goal. His main goal is the people, right? So these cities, he's not trying to take them over, he just burns them. Right? He takes the Jewish people he's there to rescue and brings them back to Judea, to the areas around Jerusalem.
He went after to get his son.
Right. He's not trying to set himself up as a king over a big, to rival our friend Seleucus. Right? That's not his goal. His goal is to free the people so that they can practice their religion. Okay, so verse 46, they came as far as Ephron, an expansive and fortified city on the highway. They could not pass through either to the right or the left. The only way to go was through the middle of town. But the men of the city closed it off and barricaded the gates with stones. So Judas sent them a peaceful word, saying, "Let us pass through your land to go to our land. No one will harm you, merely we will come through on foot." But they refused to open to him. What does that remind you of? Remember back in Numbers, when Moses and the people were coming, and they said to the Moabites, "Just let us walk head through, right? We're going to cross the Jordan. We don't want anything to do with you," right? And the Moabites didn't want to comply peacefully. Well, see, again, Judas, the whole point of his rebellion is that he wants to try and follow the law. Right? So this city, they haven't done anything to him. They haven't done anything to the Jewish people. Right? He says, "Hey, let us just walk through. We don't need any trouble." Right? Tries to be peaceful, and they're not interested. Verse 49, so Judas gave orders to proclaim to the troops that each man make camp where he was. Then the soldiers of the army made camp, and he fought the men of Ephron all day and all night, and the city was given over into his hand. He killed every male with the edge of the sword, destroyed the city completely, and took its spoils. So he passed through the city, stepping over those who were killed. Then they came to the Jordan, crossing over into the great plain facing Bethshan. And Judas gathered the stragglers and encouraged the men along the way until they entered Judah. They marched up to Mount Zion and sacrificed whole burnt offerings and offered whole burnt offerings with joy and gladness of heart, because not one of them was lost before they returned home in peace. While Judas and Jonathan had been in Gilead, and Simon his brother was in Galilee facing Ptolemais, Joseph the son of Zacharias and Azariah, officers of the army, got word of their courageous acts and the victorious battles they fought. They spoke, saying, "Let us make a name for ourselves as well, and take on the Gentiles who live around us." So this is the group. These are the guys who got left to lead the PC army that was left to defend Judea. They say, why are they having all the fun? Conquering cities and stuff. Why don't we go and attack? We got Gentiles around here. Let's go after them. Right? Verse 58, thus they gave a command to those from the army with them, and they marched to Jamnia. But Gorgias and his army went out from the city to face them in battle. Remember, we've seen Gorgias before. He's one of Antiochus's generals. And Joseph and Azariah were routed and chased as far as the boundaries of Judea. That day about 2,000 men of Israel perished. It was a great defeat for the people, for expecting to act heroically, they did not follow the orders of Judas and his brothers, and they did not belong to the seed of those men through whom Israel received the gift of deliverance. So what does this say? They went out, why? To save their fellow Jews? Right, to make a name for themselves, to get some good pillaging in, right? That's why they went out. And so they were successful, right? Because God didn't honor that, right? Verse 63, so Judas and his brothers were honored greatly throughout all Israel, and even by the Gentiles, where their name was being heard. People assembled around them and gave them praise. Then Judas went out with his brothers and fought the sons of Esau in the land of the south, and attacked Hebron and its towns, and pulled down its many fortresses, and set on fire its towers round about. He also marched into the country of the Philistines, and then on to Marisa. Some priests that day who wanted to show their courage perished in battle, for they went out to fight recklessly. But Judas turned aside to Azotus, the country of the Philistines. He destroyed their altars, set the carved idols of their gods on fire, and took spoils in the cities. Then he came back to the land of Judah. So this has been the summary of our expansion here. Right, you can see the territory on the other side of the Jordan that Judas and Jonathan picked up. You can see the territory going over to the sea coast, the Philistine territory that they gained. So they're now expanded. Still, compared to some of our previous maps, not a lot of territory, but more than before. Chapter 6, verse 1, Now King Antiochus passed through the upper countries and heard that Elymais in Persia was a splendid city for its wealth in silver and gold. Its temple contained great wealth with shields of gold, breastplates, and weaponry left there by Alexander, the son of Philip, the Macedonian king who first ruled over the Greeks. So, there's this legend, basically, that Antiochus IV hears, that Alexander's armor and his weaponry are still in the former capital of the Persian Empire. That's where he left them. Okay, so he decides, like Indiana Jones, he wants to go get them. Okay. Verse 3, So he came and sought to defeat the city and take spoils, but he failed because his plot was uncovered by the men of the city. They confronted and fought against him, and he fled and retreated from there very discouraged and went back to Babylon. Then a man came and told him while he was still in Persia that his army, which had invaded the land of Judah, was put to flight. That Lysias had gone first with a strong army, but had been put to shame before Israel. That Israel was growing strong by the weapons, supplies, and abundant spoils they had taken from the armies they had conquered. Moreover, they had pulled down the abomination he built on top of the altar in Jerusalem, and they had encircled the sanctuary with high walls as it had before, as well as Beth Zur, his hometown. So now it's while he's in Persia after this big defeat, it's now that he gets word about what's been going on in his former Judean territory, right? That it's been wiped out, that they're flaunting his decree that they should worship his gods to the point of tearing down the idol he himself put up. They rebuilt the temple, they fought off his army. All of this being bad news for him. Verse 8, When the king received this report, he was shocked and greatly shaken. He fell upon his bed and was sick with grief because matters had not gone for him as he hoped. King Antiochus lay there several days, for deepening grief worsened his condition. He concluded he was about to die. Thus he called together his friends, saying, Sleep has eluded my eyes, and anxiety has devastated my heart. I ask myself, what is this stress I have come to, and into what sea of troubles am I immersed? For I was kind and loved as a ruler. I was such a good king, too. Why would they rebel? I'm such a great guy. But now I recall the evils I did in Jerusalem, for I took all the silver and gold vessels and sent to destroy those who lived in Judah for no good reason. I know that because of these things evils have found me. Behold, I am perishing with deep grief in a foreign land. Okay. So here at least it's presented that before his death he kind of realizes he blew it. Right? He blew it. That he probably went up against the wrong God. Right? Verse 14, He then summoned Philip, one of his friends, and set him over his entire kingdom. He gave him his crown and his robe and ring, that he could take charge of his son Antiochus and raise him to rule. Thus Antiochus the king died in the 149th year. That's not his 149th year, that's the 149th year of the Greek rule. When Lysias found out the king had reposed, he established Antiochus his son to reign. Lysias had raised him from youth and called him Eupator. So, Antiochus' intent is that his friend Philip will take over. But his general grabs onto one of his sons and names him Antiochus V. He takes his name. Eupator reads, good father. Good father is his title. Whether that's a reference to his father being good or him being a good father to his people as a king, it's ambiguous. But that's the title he takes for himself. So verse 18, now men from the citadel were confining Israel to the area around the sanctuary. They were attempting by whatever means to injure them and to bring strength to the Gentiles. So he gathered all the men to defeat them. They assembled the army and attacked the city in the 150th year. He also built engines of war and other instruments of battle. So we've still got, we have to keep in mind, within Judea, okay, they've driven the Gentiles out, but we still have this faction of the Jewish people who are pro-Gentile. Right? This faction that thinks that Greek rule is a good thing and Greek culture is wonderful and they have poetry and drama. Philosophy and all these things are so much better than our dusty old Torah, right? And so at the same time that there's this war going on for independence with the Greeks, there's also a civil war going on inside Judea. Okay? And so what this is saying here is that the enemy faction in the civil war, the Hellenized Jews, right, are trying to take control of the city of Jerusalem. Yeah. And they have control of most of the city except for the area right around the temple. They were the faithful Jews because they're the ones doing the services in the temple. Right? They've holed up there around the temple, and now they're getting ready to lay siege to the area around the temple in the hopes that then they can invite the king back in. The king will say, oh, how wonderful, you aren't like these other rebellious Jews, you're my friends, and he'll give them all positions of authority, right? Because they're the king's friends. So they're sort of like the Tories of the American Revolution. Right? They're the loyalists to the Greek crown, right? Who the rebels like Judas Maccabees see as traitors to their people. So verse 21, but some of these enemies escaped from the enclosure with some ungodly Israelites siding with them. They approached the king saying, how long will it be until you render a judgment to avenge our brothers? We were pleased to serve your father and to follow what he said and obey his orders. Because of this, the sons of our people attacked the citadel and became our enemies. Besides this, they killed as many of us as they found, and our inheritances were taken away. But they have not stretched out their hand against us alone, but also against all the lands on their borders. And behold, today they have surrounded the citadel in Jerusalem to defeat it. They have strengthened the sanctuary in Beth-zur as well, so unless you quickly overtake them, they will do worse things than these, and you will be unable to stop them. So they said to Delegate, we've got a new king now. They say, you know how much we loved your dad. Great guy. Yeah. Right? We were right on board with him. He said, and you know, I'm sure by now you know about these horrible rebels. You know, who hated your dad. They're attacking your territory outside of Judea. And they've been horrible to us too. Right? We need to work something out here where you help us out. Right? You help us, we'll help you. We can restore order. Everyone will be happy again. We'll all be Greeks. So verse 28, the king was angered greatly when he heard this. So he assembled all his friends, the military leaders, and those who ruled. Armies of mercenaries came to him as well from other nations and from various islands of the seas. So the number of his armies was 100,000 foot soldiers, 20,000 cavalry, and 32 elephants trained for battle. Okay, this is a big army. Okay, remember the last time we had a complete count of Judas Maccabees' army, it was about 16,000 men total.
Yeah.
Okay.
Wasn't very big.
Okay. Well, now we've got 100,000 foot soldiers, 20,000 trained cavalry, 32 battle elephants. Okay. And I mentioned last time, elephants, how we've seen elephants at the zoo and the circus, and but imagine you'd never seen an elephant before, and imagine the first time you saw one was one with a bunch of armor plating on it, charging straight at you, while you were standing there on foot with a sword. Right? So you can appreciate their value for warfare at that time. Right? The Jews didn't see a lot of elephants. Right?
They weren't as trained in biology, so they didn't know where to poke it.
Well, that's it. But so these elephants are like the equivalent in this period of time of tanks. Right? I mean, they're gonna charge into battle and lay waste to at least your infantry. Right? They're just gonna plow through. They're gonna throw your lines into confusion. Everybody's lined up for battle. They're in formation. Not for long once an elephant starts running around them. Right? So this is a particularly deadly army here. Verse 31, they arrived through Idumea and marched against Beth-zur, fighting for many days and building engines of war. So on top of that, they're building primitive catapults, what are called ballistae, which is sort of like a giant crossbow. Okay, these things that'll hurl rocks. Okay, so they've got machinery too, because the Greeks, having figured out some mathematics, started building these things. They can knock down city walls. But Israel went out, set them on fire, and battled heroically. Verse 32, Judas then marched out from the citadel and set up camp at Beth-Zechariah, across from the king's camp. The next morning the king rose at dawn and led his army on a forced march on the highway to Beth-Zechariah. His soldiers prepared themselves for warfare and blew the trumpets. They also showed the elephants the juice of grapes and mulberries to ready them for the campaign. That sounds weird. Grapes. Yeah. The idea was that they weren't feeding them. They were holding off food and just showing them food. Right? Sort of like showing red to a bull. Right? Which I guess bulls can't see color, so I guess that's a myth or something. But anyway, like showing red to a bull, the idea is they're getting these elephants angry and charged up. Okay, so they're not going to be rolling a ball or doing any of that circus stuff, right? They're hungry, they're grumpy. These are angry elephants. And then they stationed the elephants among the phalanxes and set alongside each animal 1,000 men covered with coats of mail and with bronze helmets on their head. 500 horsemen were chosen and assigned to each elephant. So they're constructing their military around these elephants. A phalanx, and if you saw the movie, I'll refer to it again. If you saw the movie 300, you saw at one point a phalanx. A phalanx was a military configuration that the Greeks invented, where they would get together their army in a square pattern with the men facing out. And they would then bring their shields together and interlock them. So you had sort of a wall of shields going all the way around. And then they could put their spears out in between the spots of the shields, and they could move in any direction. And any enemy who was trying to fight them would just get hit by this wall of shields and spears coming at them, and there were no openings through which to try and do anything. So this was strong tactics at the time. Right? This is how the Greeks, this is how Alexander conquered most of the world. Let's do strategy like this. Okay? So they've got an elephant Right? They've got 1,000 troops grouped in phalanxes around the elephant. And then they've got cavalry stationed in between. Okay, so these are carefully constructed units that are made to just roll over and wipe out enemy infantry. Okay. And now remember, not only does Judas Maccabees have this tiny number of people comparatively, but they're using weapons and armor that they've scrounged. Right? They're just guerrilla fighters. So it's whatever they've pulled off the people they've beaten in battle. Right? They've taken their weapons, their armor, sort of hodgepodge, whatever they've put together. Okay, not fully equipped with their bronze helmets and armor, shields. Verse 36, these positioned themselves beforehand wherever the animal was, and wherever it went they rode alongside and never left it alone. Sturdy covered wooden towers were strapped upon each elephant by a special harness, and 4 armed men fought from inside each tower with its Indian driver. So this is a war elephant. I can't draw an elephant. But you have to picture on top of the elephant, in addition to the elephant itself having armor plating on parts of its body, strapped to its back, they've got this big wooden structure, okay, with inside soldiers with spears and with bows, okay, who are up on this elevated position on top of the elephant taking pot shots, right? While the elephant's rampaging around, they're stabbing and shooting, throwing javelins from the top of the elephant. Are you getting the picture here that this battle does not look good for our friend Judas Maccabees? Verse 38, they positioned the remainder of the horsemen on each side on the 2 flanks of the forces, disturbing the enemy while they themselves were protected by the phalanxes. As the sun shined on the golden and bronze shields, the hills glistened from them and lit up like a flaming fire. So they're coming in over the hills, the sun's reflecting off everything, it looks like the hills are on fire. Okay, coming down toward where the Judean troops are. While one sector of the king's forces was stretched out on the high hills and some were on the plain, they marched on steadfastly in good order. Everyone trembled when they heard the sounds of the soldiers as they marched along, and the clanging of their weapons, for the army was massive and very strong. But Judas drew near with his army in battle formation, and 600 of the king's men fell. Then Eleazar, called Avron, saw one of the elephants covered with royal armor. It was taller than the rest, and he reasoned the king was riding it. Okay, so in the midst of this battle, they kill 600 of them, which isn't much considering they've got, 150,000, killing 600 isn't doing that great. But he spots this one elephant that's more decorated than all the other elephants. It's bigger than all the other elephants. Right? And he says, I bet the king himself is inside that tower, that structure on top of that elephant, and that's where he's participating in the battle from. Verse 44, so he laid down his life to rescue his people and to make an everlasting name for himself. He ran boldly into the center of the phalanx, killing soldiers to the right and left, and they got out of his way on both flanks. Okay? So he manages to fight his way into the middle of one of these phalanxes. He manages to break through the line, right, and get into the middle where now he's got the backs of these guys. So he fights his way through to the elephant. Verse 46, then he crawled underneath the elephant, struck it from beneath and killed it. It fell to the ground on top of him and he died there. Okay. Well, he went for the suicide attack. Right? He
sure did.
He went in, he fought his way through, he killed the elephant, but he dies too. When the Israelites saw the royal might and the fierce attack of the troops, they turned away from them in flight. But the soldiers of the king's army went up to Jerusalem to attack them. And the king set up camp in Judea and on Mount Zion. He reached a peace accord with the men of Beth-zur, who evacuated the city because they had no food there to withstand a siege, for it was a sabbatical year for the land. So the king captured Beth-zur and set a guard there to secure it. Okay, so he They kill 600 guys and the king's elephant. That's not enough. So they fall into retreat. He chases them back to Jerusalem. And the king takes back the city of Beth-zur that's near Jerusalem to use it as a base of operations now while he goes after Jerusalem. He then set a camp opposite the sanctuary for several days and built siege towers, engines of war, which threw fire and stones, machines to fire off arrows and catapults. The defenders also made engines of war to match theirs, so they battled several days. So you have to picture for several days, you've got one army camped outside the city, one army camped in the city, both using these siege engines, both lobbing
Stuff at each other.
rocks, firing stuff, shooting arrows, back and forth. Verse 53, but with no food stored up because it was the 7th year, and the men who survived in Judea against the Gentiles had eaten the remaining provisions. Few men remained in the sanctuary, for hunger had overtaken them. They scattered each to his own place. Okay? So, remember they're following the law. The law says the 7th year you don't harvest your crops. You leave them for the poor. They're following it, but unfortunately, that's when the enemy attacks and lays siege, so they don't have a lot of food to work with. Okay. Verse 55, now Lysias got word that Philip, whom Antiochus the king had chosen while still alive to raise Antiochus his son to rule, had returned from Persia and Media with the armies that had gone there with the king, and that he was trying to gain control of the kingdom. Okay. So remember, when Antiochus IV was dying, he put his friend Philip in charge. Okay. Lysias the general grabbed his son and made him king. And that's who's now laying siege. Well, Lysias hears, Philip is back from Persia, where he was with Antiochus IV when he died. He's got an army with him, and he's planning on setting himself up as king instead of Antiochus V. Verse 57, so Lysias decided immediately to send a message to the king, the commanders and the men, saying, we grow weaker each day, our food supply is running out. The force we are fighting against is strong, and governing the kingdom puts pressure on us. Therefore let us come to an agreement with these men and have peace with them and their nation. We should arrange for them to live by their laws as before, for it was because of their laws which we abolished that they became furious and did all the things they have done. Now, we're Antiochus V, was he winning or losing? He was winning, right? He was about to wipe them out, okay? But him wiping out Jerusalem doesn't do him any good if Philip goes back and takes his throne, right? So this is a little bit of diplomacy. Wow, this is a hard battle. I don't know who's going to win. We better just go ahead and make peace with them so we can get back to the business of ruling this kingdom, meaning so we can go head off Philip on his way to Antioch. Right? And he says, you know what? The whole problem was caused by us telling them they couldn't follow their laws anymore. They couldn't worship their God. Let's just let them. Right? Let's just be gracious. We'll just let them do that. Then everything will be fine. Right? Now what's interesting is they're essentially now going from winning and wiping out the Jewish army to giving the Jewish people everything they wanted in the first place. Right? Verse 60, this word pleased the king and the commanders. So he sent an offer of peace to the Israelites, which they accepted, surprisingly enough. Hey, how about we just retract our army and let you guys do whatever you want? Sounds good to us, Thus the king and the commanders gave them their oath. On these conditions the Israelites evacuated the fortress. But when the king came to Mount Zion and saw the fortification of the place, he broke his promise and commanded his men to pull down the surrounding wall. Then he left hastily and came back to Antioch. There he discovered Philip in charge, so he attacked him and captured the city by force. So he does take a little bit of a parting shot. Right? He sees the wall they've built around the temple, so he pulls that down and then takes off back for Antioch. Philip got there before him, and so he has to lay siege to Antioch and conquer it. So now chapter 7. Now if you thought things were getting interesting with just Philip Antiochus V. Chapter 7, verse 1. Demetrius, the son of Seleucus, set forth from Rome in the 151st year, sailed with a few men into the city by the sea, Antioch, and reigned there. Okay. Who is this guy?
How did he reign there all of a sudden?
There's some details left out here.
A few.
Okay, Demetrius. Well, I should start with Rome. Because we haven't really heard what's been going on with Rome lately. Right? In fact, we haven't heard about them at all. Rome has now taken over pretty much all of what's now Italy. Okay, the Roman Republic. At this point, Rome is a republic. Okay, so they've got a senate that rules over them. Okay, they don't have a king. They have a senate. They have something like a democracy. And they've been engaged in a whole bunch of wars. The main wars being against the Phoenicians. Okay, remember our friends the Phoenicians from Tyre and Sidon? Well, Alexander the Great conquered and destroyed Tyre and Sidon. The city of Tyre was on an island. It was considered unconquerable. Alexander had his men haul rocks, and they built a land bridge out to the island and laid siege to the city. And if you go there in Lebanon today, there are actually remains of Alexander's land bridge that he built there that you can still see in order to conquer it. So Tyre and Sidon then were no longer the capitals of the Phoenician Empire. We talked before about the Phoenicians. Mainly it was a shipping empire. They were shipping around the Mediterranean. Well, they had established cities all along the coast of North Africa. And the biggest one of those was Carthage. So when Tyre and Sidon were destroyed, Carthage became their capital. But they also controlled most of what's now Spain. And they had set up colonies moving toward Italy. So they made war with the Romans 3 times. They're called the Punic Wars by the Romans. And the third time, the Romans completely obliterated them. And that means not only did they conquer all the territory in Spain and North Africa that they'd had, but that the city of Carthage was reduced to rubble. And traditionally, though archaeologists now are casting some doubt on it, they went and poured salt into the fields all around the city and worked it into the soil, so you wouldn't be able to grow anything. So they couldn't come back. The third time. So after the third war, they said, we've had enough of fighting these Phoenicians. Now there's going to be no more Phoenicians. So at that point, the Phoenician civilization is essentially wiped out. Okay, and that's in the 3rd century BC, the 200s BC. Okay, so now we're between 150 160 BC. Here in Maccabees, Rome is an ascending power. They now control the whole western half of the Mediterranean. Okay? And they don't have an emperor. They've got this republic, but they're very open to trade treaties and negotiations and trying to integrate with these other powers in the eastern Mediterranean. Okay? Now, about 100 years after this is when we're going to have first Julius Caesar and then Caesar Augustus, who are going to turn Rome into an empire. Okay, and go and conquer Egypt, Syria, the rest of the known world, and make it all the Roman Empire. But right now, Rome is a republic, and it's the western half. It's the western half of the Mediterranean. But, as I said, they're getting involved. They're starting to get involved in what's going on in the rest of at least the Mediterranean world. And so they have a pick. They found this fellow Demetrius, who's a descendant of Seleucus. And he's a good friend of the Roman Senate and its people, which is the phrase they used to use in Rome. He's a good friend of the Senate and the people of Rome. And so they would very much like him to be the king of Syria and all the East, because that would open up all kinds of trade relationships, all kinds of political arrangements. And so what this is saying in that couple of verses is that Rome sponsors him to come over and take over Antioch and seize the throne. Okay? He's not a descendant of Antiochus V, but he's related to Seleucus, the founder of the dynasty, and so they pick him to be their guy in Syria. Okay. Verse 2, chapter 7, as he entered the royal house of his fathers, his army seized Antiochus and Lysias and brought them to him. When he became aware of this action, he said, "Do not show me their faces." So the soldiers put them to death, and Demetrius occupied the throne of his kingdom. Right? So he didn't want to get his hands dirty. Right? You know, he said, "Well, your cousins here, and his general, and they're the ones who currently think they're king." And he says, "Oh, I don't want to be involved in any of it." So the soldiers go off and execute them. Verse 5, then all the lawless and ungodly men of Israel came to him. The lawless and ungodly men of Israel. Who are these? These are those Hellenist Jews, right? Who really love the Greek civilization. So we've got another new king. Right? We've got Demetrius the First. And so they say, "Oh, new king, new opportunity." Right? So they all show up. They all show up to greet them. Led by, in verse 5, Alchemus, who wanted to be a priest. Okay. So Alchemus has decided he should be not just a priest, but he's decided he should be the high priest. Right? He is related to Aaron. He is related to Aaron. Okay, and at this time, they don't actually have a high priest. Okay. So he can kind of make a case. Okay, but the way he's going about doing it isn't going to his people and saying, "Hey, I'm a descendant of Aaron." Right? Elect to be high priest. It's going to the Greek king saying, "Hey, I'm your friend. Let's be friends. You know, how about I help you get Jerusalem back under control, and then you put me in charge." So verse 6, they brought charges against the people before the king, saying, "Judas and his brothers have destroyed all your friends and scattered us from our land. Therefore send a man you trust, and let him see all the destruction he did to us and to the country of the king. Then let him bring punishment to them and all who serve them." So they show up and say, "You know, I know you're new around here, these parts, so you don't know all the trouble these guys have caused your family. Right, but send somebody down there to take a look, and then, you know, we'll help you get things back under control." Verse 8, the king then appointed Maccabees, one of his friends, who ruled the province of beyond the river, for he was prominent in the kingdom and loyal to the king. Then he sent him and the ungodly Alchemus, whom he appointed to the priesthood, and ordered him to avenge the sons of Israel. It's kind of vague what the author thinks of Alchemus. The ungodly Alchemus. So the king goes in and says, "Oh yeah, I'll make you a high priest." You know, doesn't mean anything to him. You want to be high priest of the Jews? Great. You know? So he could be the Grand Moff, you know, whatever. But he sends them down there. Verse 10, they marched on with a large army and came into the land of Judah, and sent envoys to Judas and his brothers with peaceful words full of deceit. But they did not heed their words, for they noticed they came with a large army. So they come down and they say, "Hey, brother, we're just coming back here to Judea." And just kind of goes, "Yeah, and you got like thousands of Greek troops with you. What's up with that?" Verse 12, then a delegation of scribes was sent to meet with Alchemus and Maccabees to request justice. The Hasidians were the first among the sons of Israel to seek peace with them. For they said, "A man, a priest from the seed of Aaron, came with their forces, and he will not do us wrong." Okay. We talked before about the Hasidians. It's from the same root as Hasidic Jews now. It means faithful. Okay. So these are sort of the super Orthodox Jews who really want to follow the Torah, right? They say, "Hey, this guy's descended from Aaron, right? Wants to be high priest, right?" So they go back and say, "Well, this could be good, right?" So they go out to try and see if they can negotiate something. Verse 15, the priest spoke peacefully to them and promised them, saying, "We will not seek to injure you or your friends." They believed him, but he overtook 60 of their men and put them to death in one day. According to the word which was written, they poured out the flesh of your saints and their blood around Jerusalem, but there was no one to bury them. Okay, so he acts friendly. Then when he gets the chance, literally stabs them in the back. Okay, our friend, the ungodly priests. Then fear and trembling fell upon all the people, for they said, "There is no truth and uprightness in them, for they violated the promise and oath they swore." So Maccabees departed from Jerusalem and marched to Bethzaeth. He sent for and captured many of the soldiers who deserted him, and some of the people, and he slaughtered them at the great well. He put Alchemists in charge of the region and left an army with him to serve him. Then Maccabees returned to the king. So Maccabees doesn't really want to get involved, right? So he sort of sets up, he says to our friend the new high priest, "Well, here's some soldiers, you take care of it." He goes back to Antioch. Alchemists then strove for the high priesthood, and all who harassed their people also gathered with him. They took control of the country of Judah and damaged Israel greatly. Now Judah saw all the evil alchemists and those with him had done among the sons of Israel. It was worse than what the Gentiles did. Thus Judas departed to all the regions surrounding Judea and took vengeance on the men who had deserted. He forbade those in the city to journey out to the countryside. But when Alchemists realized Judas and his followers were growing strong and knew that he could not prevail against them, he went back and brought evil charges against them before the king. Right? So he makes some headway at first. As soon as Judas starts fighting back against his troops, he runs back to the king with more, "Oh, that's horrible, I need more help." Oh. So verse 26, the king then sent Nicanor, one of his renowned commanders who hated and disdained Israel, and ordered him to get rid of the people. Nicanor came up to Jerusalem with a large army, and he sent Judas and his brothers peaceful words full of deceit, saying, "Let there be no quarrel between us. I will come peacefully with a few men to see you in person." So he approached Judas, and they greeted each other peacefully, but the adversaries prepared to seize Judas. Then Judas was aware that Nicanor had come with deceit, and he feared him, so he did not care to meet him again. When Nicanor learned his plot had been discovered, he went into battle with Judas at Kephar Salama. Some 500 of Nicanor's soldiers fell. The remainder fled to the city of David. After this, Nicanor went up to Mount Zion. Then some priests came out of the sanctuary along with some elders of the people to greet him in peace, showing him the whole burnt offering which they had sacrificed on behalf of the king. Notice, remember we talked about this in Nehemiah. This was already a practice that even though the king's a pagan, in this case hates them, right, wants to see them destroyed, they still offer a sacrifice every day to God on behalf of the king, praying for the king. And we see this going for, this goes all the way forward to today, where we pray for the President of the United States here. If you're in Canada, the Prime Minister, and whoever the civil ruler is. Doesn't matter how evil or rotten he is. Right? Whoever your civil ruler is, you pray for him. St. Paul prayed for Caligula when Caligula was emperor. Yeah. So this is a tradition that goes all the way back to that. But so this is their attempt to make peace. Right? This is the king's general coming to wipe them out. They say, "Look, we come and we pray for the king, to our God." Right? We offer a sacrifice for the king to our God. We're not the king's enemies. Right? We don't hate the king. Verse 34, however, he mocked and ridiculed them. He defiled them and spoke with arrogance to them. He also swore an oath angrily, saying, "Unless Judas and his troops are delivered into my hands now, then if I come back in peace, I will set this house on fire." Then he stormed out in great rage. The priests then entered and stood facing the altar in the sanctuary. They wept and cried out, "You chose this place to be called by your name, that it might be a house of prayer and supplication for your people. Take vengeance on this man and on his soldiers, and let them die by the sword. Remember their blasphemies and let them be alive no longer." Notice in verse 37, the first half of that. "You chose this place to be called by your name, that it might be a house of prayer and supplication for your people."
Yeah.
Does that remind you of anywhere else? Or when Jesus comes in and cleanses the temple, and he drives out the money changers. He says God's house is to be a house of prayer, but you made it a den of robbers. You have to understand this here to understand how cutting that remark is, because he's comparing the money changers to the Greeks and what they did to the temple. Okay? So that's a little heftier insult than just calling them thieves, right? He's saying they've desecrated the temple the same way the Greeks did. So verse 39, soon Nicanor left Jerusalem and camped at Beth-horon, and the army of Syria joined him. But Judas took position in Adasa with 3,000 troops. Judas prayed, saying, when the ambassadors from the king uttered blasphemy, your angel went forth and struck 185,000 of the Assyrians. Remember that when the Assyrians laid siege to Jerusalem? And came and talked a lot of trash on God and everybody else. And the people prayed, and the angel of the Lord went out and slaughtered them. Verse 42, crush also this army before us today, and let the others know that he spoke blasphemy against your sanctuary, and judge him according to his malice. So the armies faced off in war the 13th day of the month of Adar, and Nicanor's army was scattered. He himself was the first to fall in the war. That tells you something, because the general usually is not the guy up at the front.
Right.
First one dead is the general. When his soldiers saw Nicanor die, they dropped their weapons and ran. Israel even chased them a day's journey from Adasa as far as Gezerah. As they pursued them, they kept blowing the trumpets, sounding the battle call. Then the Israelites went out from all the villages around Judea and outflanked the adversaries. They drove them back to the pursuing army, and they all fell by the sword. Not one of them survived. Then Israel captured the spoils and their possessions. They even beheaded Nicanor and severed his right hand, which he had stretched out arrogantly. They carried them and put them on display just outside Jerusalem. Kind of gruesome. But remember, what is this calling back to? Remember Goliath's head. Goliath came out and blasphemed against God. And so when David defeated him, they took his head. They took his head and put on, this is what happens when you... And so this is calling back to that Nicanor had come and blasphemed God. And this is the result. Verse 48, so the people were very glad, and they celebrated that day as a day of great joy. A decree came forth to celebrate this day at the same time every year on the 13th day of Adar. Thus the land of Judah had peace for several days. This is actually a Jewish holiday. It's one of the really low ranked ones. But there is still a day of Nicanor on the Jewish calendar that celebrates this day when he was killed for having blasphemed the... No, just as a... So if you go and talk to an Orthodox rabbi, you can probably figure out for you, or it's somewhere on the calendar when it falls. I don't know what they do, if anything, to celebrate it anymore. Hopefully it doesn't involve heads and right hands. So chapter 8, verse 1. Now, we've already talked about, there's a little bit of moral ambiguity here with Judas Maccabeus, right? Because we've seen, he's got the right motives, right? But sometimes his methods seem to be a little iffy. You know, burning down towers with men, women, and children locked inside of them. Right? There's sort of some extreme zeal going on. Okay? But on the whole, he and his brothers have been pretty faithful. Things take a turn now. Okay? Things are going to take a turn now the rest of the book. And we're going to see how this rebellion that started out as this good thing for the Torah, it's going to start to turn into something else. So I'm just going to tease it a little bit there. And if you see the heading to chapter 8 here in the Orthodox Study Bible, packed with the Romans, that might give you a clue. Because if you haven't read this before, you may think that, you know, the whole problem, like we've been talking about as far as a lot of the Jews were concerned in the New Testament, is the Romans. But the Romans had taken control of Judea. Judea was a Roman province. They were ruled by the Romans. The Romans were pagans. And you might have thought, oh, well, the Romans must have come and conquered them. Okay? That's not what happened. The Romans did not come and conquer Judea. The Romans got invited to Judea. Okay? And a big part of that story we're now going to see unfold here in 1 Maccabees. And the thing we have to remember sort of a previous example, remember King Hezekiah, after he was delivered, he was on the whole pretty good king, right? He repented, remember? But then right at the end of his reign, he blew it. You remember how he blew it? He was worried about the Assyrians, and so he invited the Babylonians to come check out Jerusalem and to make a treaty with them, right? And what happened? The Babylonians ended up, yeah. Here we are now in chapter 8, verse 1. Then Judas learned of the reputation of the Romans, that they were mighty and behaved well toward all who made a pact with them. They would ensure friendship with as many as came to them, indeed because they were of great strength. Okay, so he hears, remember Romans, they're over in the western part of the Mediterranean, but as we saw with Demetrius, they're interested now in getting involved here in the eastern Mediterranean. Verse 2, people also told him of their warfare and the courageous works they were doing in Gaul. That's what's now France. How they conquered them and imposed taxes on them. They also reported what they had done in the country of Spain to take control of their silver and gold mines, and how they dominated the entire region by their careful planning and forbearance, although the area was a great distance away. The Romans also defeated kings who challenged them from around the world until they subdued them and struck a deadly blow against them. But the others paid them tax each year. That's referring mainly to the Phoenicians, who I mentioned. Verse 5, they battled and soundly conquered Philip and Perseus, kings of the Macedonians, and others who stood up against them in war. They further conquered Antiochus, the great king of Asia, who went to war against them with 120 elephants and cavalry and chariots and a massive army, but his troops were destroyed by them. They captured him alive and ordered that he and those who would rule in the future should pay large taxes along with hostages. They also took from him the countries of India, Media, and Lydia, and they gave him some of the best of all these territories to King Eumenes. So this is another person who thought he could fuss with the Romans, and so the Romans now, they haven't taken over those areas, but they're taxing them. Basically, they've imposed these taxes after defeating them militarily. So Judas is hearing about this. These people are powerful, right? But what he's more thinking is, these Greeks, right? Every few years they come and invade again. Right? He's constantly war with the Greeks. Who can I leverage against the Greeks? Who are the Greeks not going to want to mess with? Sort of like Hezekiah was thinking, who are the Assyrians not going to... Okay? So he said, who are the Greeks? They're not going to want to mess with the Romans. Right? So maybe if I talk to the Romans, I could get these Greeks off my back. Verse 9, the Greeks also plotted to come against them, but this became known to the Romans, and they sent one of their generals against them. He fought with them, and many wounded fell, and the Romans took their wives and children captive. They robbed them, took their land, pulled down their fortresses, and have to this day enslaved them. They crushed and captured the remaining kingdoms in the islands, as many as would oppose them. But they secured a relationship with their friends and those people who relied on them. Thus they conquered rulers far away and nearby. As many as had heard of their reputation feared them. Those the Romans desired to help and to raise up as kings they establish, and those kings they wish to depose they depose, for they have great power. But despite all this, none of the Romans has donned a crown or vested in purple so as to be magnified by it. Instead, they formed a council for themselves, and 320 senators constantly deliberate concerning the people to help them behave in an orderly fashion. That's one way of describing it, I guess. Help them behave. They trust one man to govern them for a year and to rule over their land. And everyone heeds this one leader, and there is no jealousy or strife amongst them. That's referring to the procurator of the Senate, who would be elected for 1 year, and he was basically in charge of the Senate, and it just rotated continuously. Before Rome became a republic, they had been ruled over by a group of kings they called the tyrants. And they had had sort of a revolution against that, and the heads of the ruling families, the wealthy families, had formed the Senate at that point. So they were very distrustful of kings at this point, which is why Julius Caesar, when he first became Caesar, ended up getting stabbed in the back 23 times. But we'll get to that later. So verse 17, now Judas appointed Eupolemus, the son of John, son of Achos, and Jason, the son of Eleazar, and dispatched them to Rome to build friendship and an alliance, and to free their people from a yoke of bondage, because they realized the Greek kingdom was subjecting Israel to total servitude. So they journeyed to Rome, a very long trip. When they came to the Senate chamber, they said the following: Judas, also named Maccabees, his brothers and the Jewish people, sent us here to you to build an alliance and have peace with you, that you may enlist us as your friends and allies. Verse 21, the proposal pleased the Senate, so this is the copy of the message they issued in reply, inscribed on bronze tablets and sent to Jerusalem, to be kept there as a record of peace and friendship. Verse 23, may it be well with the Roman people, and the Jewish nation shall respond wholeheartedly as their allies, as the occasion may dictate. If war comes first to Rome or to any of their allies in all their dominion, the Judean nation shall act as their allies wholeheartedly, as the occasion may dictate to them. As to any enemy who wages war, the Jews shall not donate or supply grain, weapons, money, or ships, as Rome has stated, and they shall honor these commitments without getting anything in return. Similarly, should war break out first against the Jewish nation, the Romans shall freely respond as their allies as is appropriate for them. Further, no grain, weapons, money, or ships will be given to allies of the enemy, as Rome has decided, and they shall hold to these obligations and do so with no deception. Thus the Romans offer a treaty with the Jews on these terms. If after these agreements take effect both parties should decide to add or subtract anything, they shall do so by agreement, and whatever they add or subtract shall be binding. Now regarding the evils Demetrius the king is doing to them, we have sent to him this word: if therefore they appeal to us against you again, we will defend their rights and oppose you, be it on the sea or on land. Okay. So essentially, boiled down, the treaty says, anybody attacks you, we'll come assist you as your allies. Anybody attacks Rome or any of Rome's allies, you have to come assist us. Okay? This is their first treaty with Rome, and they have a special note to Demetrius, right, who's their guy anyway, saying, take note of this new treaty, no more attacking the Judeans, because they're our friends now too. Okay. So this is the beginning. Rome's now been invited into this treaty. So now, who is Judas Maccabeus counting on to defend him now? Rome. Not God anymore.
Not God anymore, right?
Right? Even though he had all these victories where he was hugely outnumbered, now he's going to rely on Rome. Chapter 9, now Demetrius got word that Nicanor and his men had fallen in battle. So he authorized Maccabees and Alcimus to go a second time into the land of Judah and take the right-hand flank of the army with them. Thus they traveled the highway into Gilgal and camped at Mesalod and Arbela. They captured it and many people died. Then in the first month of the 152nd year they encamped opposite Jerusalem. But they departed there and went to Berea, 20,000 foot soldiers and 2,000 cavalry with them. Now Judah set up camp in Elasa, and 3,000 chosen men accompanied him. When they saw how large the number of the enemy forces was, they were very afraid, and many sneaked out of the camp. Just 800 men remained among them. So many is kind of an understatement. He's got 3,000 guys, they see the enemy, 2,200 of them head for home. Right? 2,200 split, he's got 800 men left. When Judas realized his troops had run away and the battle was pressing upon him, he was greatly discouraged and had no time to rally them. Though weary, he said to those who remained, let us arise and move out against our enemies. We may yet be able to fight them. But they kept trying to turn him back, saying, we are not able. Let us rather save our lives now. Let us return with our brothers and fight against them later, for we are too few. So they're saying to Judas, look, time for a tactical retreat. There's only 800 of us left. We're all going to die here. But Judas answered, may it be far from us to do such a thing, to run away from them. If our time has come to die, then let us die courageously for the sake of our people. We will not leave behind a charge against our honor. And the forces of Maccabees moved out from the camp in formation and stood to encounter them. The mounted troops were divided into two parts, and the sling throwers and the archers advanced before the army. Along with all the chief warriors, Maccabees was on the right flank. Then the phalanx drew near between the companies on both sides and sounded their trumpets. The army of Judas also blew its trumpets. The ground shook by the clamor of the troops, and the battle raged on from morning until nightfall. Judas realized that Maccabees had the strength of his forces on the right flank. So all the stout-hearted men came together with Judas. They demolished the right flank and pursued Maccabees' men all the way to Mount Azotus. When those on the left flank saw that the right flank was broken, they reversed course and followed closely behind the army of Judas. The battle was fierce, and many men on both sides suffered wounds and fell. Judas also fell, and his men fled. So they're moving in two groups, the right flank and the left flank. Judas takes the men he has and attacks the right flank. That means the left flank comes around behind him. Judas gets killed, and the men who are still alive flee. Jonathan and Simon took Judas their brother and buried him in the tomb of his fathers in Modin. They wept for him, and all Israel mourned him with great lamentation for many days, saying, "How the mighty has fallen, Israel's Savior." Now the abundant acts of Judas, his wars, the brave things he did, and his greatness are not recorded, for there were far too many. I thought they were going to talk about the annals of some kings, but no, they're... Verse 23, after Judas' death, the lawless emerged in all the regions of Israel, and all those rose up who worked evil. So all of a sudden, all our Greek loyalist Jewish friends come out of the woodwork because Judas is dead. Oh, good, revolution's over. Right? Now we can go back to business as usual. In those days there was a very great famine, and the nation deserted with the evildoers to Maccabees. He chose godless men and appointed them lords of the country. These men sought out and searched for the allies of Judas, bringing them to Maccabees. He took vengeance on them and mocked them. There was great perplexity in Israel, such as had not been since the days when the prophets ceased to be seen in their midst. Then all of Judas's friends came together and spoke to Jonathan. "Since your brother Judas died, a man like him has not come out to take on our enemies, namely Maccabees and those from our country who hate us. Therefore we have now chosen you this day to replace him as our ruler and be our leader in battle." So Jonathan accepted the command at once and rose up in the place of Judas's brother. When Maccabees heard this, he sought to kill him. But Jonathan, Simon his brother, and everyone with him knew of this, and they escaped to the desert of Tekoa and camped near the waters of the pool of Asphar. Maccabees discovered this on the Sabbath, and he and his army all crossed over the Jordan. So Jonathan sent John his brother as leader of the people, and he begged his Nabatean friends for approval to store their huge amount of baggage with them. The sons of Jombri from Medeba came out and seized John and left with everything he had. So things are going badly. They appoint Jonathan, Judas' brother, to take over. He says he'll take over, and then promptly gets greeted by a death squad, right, for Maccabees. So he runs to flee into the desert. So you can see where the Nabateans are. He's out in the desert. The Nabateans are a group of nomadic Arab tribes. And so he sends his younger brother to one of these Arab tribes to say, can we come and stay with you? Can we at least store some of our stuff with you? They respond by grabbing his brother and stealing all his stuff. All right. So verse 37, after these things happened, they told Jonathan and his brother Simon, saying, "The sons of Jambri are holding a great marriage feast, and they are bringing the bride from Nadabath, a daughter of one of the great noblemen of Canaan, with a huge convoy." They remembered the blood of John their brother and went up and hid under the cover of the mountain. They raised their eyes and looked, and behold, there was a noisy crowd coming with much baggage. Okay, so they hear tell the same group of tribesmen are having a big wedding. All right, and the bride's coming with all these goods. All right, so they go, they find it, and lo and behold, here's the caravan. The bridegroom also came forth with his friends and brothers to meet them with tambourines, the musicians, and many weapons. Jonathan's men rose up against them from an ambush and killed them. Many of the wounded also fell, and the rest fled to the mountain. So they took all their spoils. The wedding was changed to mourning, and the sound of the musicians became like a dirge. Thus they avenged their brother's blood and returned to the low ground of the Jordan. You see the shift things are taking? We went from success to failure after the treaty with Rome, and now they're out fighting nomadic tribes and taking petty revenge. these blood feuds back and forth. Verse 43, Maccabees then heard of this and arrived with a large army on the Sabbath at the banks of the Jordan. So Jonathan said to those with him, "Let us stand and fight for our lives, for today is not as yesterday or the day before. Behold, the battle is before us and behind us. The water of the Jordan is on this side and that, and the low ground and thicket is not the place to turn aside. Now therefore cry out to heaven that you may be saved from the hand of our adversaries." So the battle was joined, and Jonathan reached out his hand to strike Maccabees, who ducked aside and went behind him. Then Jonathan and his forces jumped into the Jordan River, swimming to the other side. Maccabees and his army did not cross over the Jordan to strike them. About 1,000 of Maccabees' soldiers fell on that day. Maccabees then returned to Jerusalem and built fortified cities in Judea. The fortresses were in Jericho and in Emmaus, Beth-horon, Bethel, Timnath, Pherathon, and Tephon, all with high walls, gates, and bars. So you've even lost Emmaus now. It's been taken back. He also placed a guard in them, and they were hostile to Israel. Then he strengthened the cities of Beth-zur and Gezerah, the citadel, and placed armies in them with stores of provisions. He also seized the sons of the rulers of the area, holding them hostage under armed guards at the citadel in Jerusalem. Then in the 153rd year, in the second month, Alchemist issued the command to take down the wall of the inner court of the sanctuary. Then he took down the work of the prophets and started to destroy it. So this is our friend, the ungodly Alchemist, right? He's now got Jerusalem, so he's now set himself up as the high priest. And he decides he's going to make some renovations. Some renovations in the temple. Specifically, remember the temple was built sort of like the tabernacle, where you had sort of the most holy place, the courtyard, outside the courtyard. Okay? Well, in the temple, you have the Holy of Holies, the holy place, the courtyard, and the outside courtyard wall is what separates out, for example, the Gentiles, unclean people. Okay? So what Alchemist is doing is he's tearing down that outside wall. Okay? Why would he do that? Well, he wants it to be more like a Greek temple. Right? Everybody can come and go. Gentiles welcome here, right? He's friends with the Greeks. So he starts tearing down the wall. Verse 55, at that instant, Alchemist was stricken. His mischief was thwarted. His mouth was shut up and he became paralyzed. He could not even speak a word so as to give orders concerning his property. So he doesn't even have time to leave a will. Falls over paralyzed. So Alchemist died then and there in great pain. When Maccabees saw that Alchemist had died, he returned to King Demetrius. Thus the land of Judah was peaceful for 2 years. Soon all the lawless men deliberated among themselves, saying, "Behold, Jonathan and those with him are living in peace and certitude. Now therefore let us bring Maccabees back here, and he will seize them all in one night." So Alchemist dies, his friend Maccabees leaves. There's peace in Jerusalem, but our Hellenistic Jewish friends, they're not about peace, right? They're like, hey, now's our chance, right? Jonathan and his guys probably think, oh, Maccabees is gone. They don't have anything to worry about. We got to get him back down here now. Now we can take them all out. Verse 59, so they went and conversed with him, and he departed to come with a large army, secretly sending letters to all his allies in Judea, telling them to capture Jonathan and those with him. But they could not do so because their plot had been discovered. So Jonathan and his men caught about 50 of their countrymen who were the leaders of the agitation and killed them. Verse 62, then Jonathan, Simon, and those with them departed for Bethbasi in the desert, and rebuilt the outpost that had been destroyed and strengthened it. When Maccabees heard of this, he gathered all his army and sent orders to the men of Judea. Then he arrived and camped at Bethbasi and attacked it for many days, making engines of war. But Jonathan left Simon his brother in the city and headed out into the country with a handful of men. He struck Odomera and his brothers and the sons of Phasaron inside their tents. Then he launched his attack and entered into battle with his armies. Meanwhile, Simon and those with him came out of the city and set on fire the engines of war. Once they took the offensive against Maccabees, he was crushed by them. They upset him greatly because his plan of attack was in vain. Also, he was filled with rage at his advisors, the lawless men who urged him to come into the country. So he killed many of them and then decided to return home. Okay, so he goes, the battle goes really badly. And he says, who was it who told me to come down here and attack? Kills them too. Heads back to Antioch. When Jonathan learned of these events, he sent envoys to make peace with Maccabees and to obtain freedom for the captives. Maccabees accepted the proposal and swore to Jonathan he would not harm him all the days of his life. He returned him the hostages taken earlier from the land of Judah. Then he returned to his homeland and made no further attempt to come into their country. Thus the sword was laid down in Israel. Then Jonathan settled down in Michmash, where he began to judge the people and to destroy the ungodly men of Israel. Well, that sounds like it's kind of good, maybe. Right? Jonathan is in charge now. He's getting rid of these troublemaking Hellenized Jews. We're going to leave off here tonight. But just to give you a little foreshadowing, again, if you have the Orthodox Study Bible in front of you, you might notice what the next chapter heading is. Alexander appoints Jonathan high priest. Our friend Jonathan who's been killing all these people. Do you remember what tribe Judas Maccabees and his family were from last time? It was Simeon. And they were, I mentioned back in Ezra, you say, Simeon, weren't they wiped out with the rest of Israel? Remember back in Ezra, there was that group of Gentiles who had helped the Judahites, and so they were being sort of honorary Simeonites. So they're honorary Simeonites. Not even really Jews. Definitely not Levites. Definitely not descended from Aaron. So that gives you an idea where this is, the direction this is going. Hey, but unless anybody has any questions, we'll leave off there for tonight and pick up with chapter 10 next time, and we'll probably finish 1 Maccabees next time, though I'm usually wrong when I say that. Oh, I did want to ask, next week is the annual congregational meeting. So do people still want to have a class?
Have you ever been to one of those meetings?
Yes, I have.
Hopefully the meeting should be quick.
So yes, no. I've got one no. Do I have any yeses? If I have no firm yeses, we'll just say no class next week. Okay, so 2 weeks from tonight, we'll come back and pick up in Maccabees chapter 10. And probably finish 1 Maccabees. So thank you, everybody.